welcome Jean Russo as our fourth guest for the Annual Heritage Conversations that talk about the development of our county. Tonight we're going to talk about the importance of the tobacco industry in the beginnings of the colony in the 16th and 17th centuries. Jean has written a book, co-authored a book with her daughter, Jean, called Planting an Empire. That book deals with the tobacco industry in both the Virginia and Maryland colonies. Of course, we're most interested here in Maryland. Why did the Maryland colony develop around the production of, or the growth of tobacco, as opposed to one of those things, silver and gold, or pelts, or another crop other than the tobacco?
Because Maryland was smart enough to let the Virginians come first and figure out what worked and what didn't work. And all the things the Virginians expected to be able to do never panned out. They were lucky that John Rolfe got shipwrecked in Bermuda and discovered Orinoco strain of tobacco and brought it to the colony and found that it did very well there. So when Maryland is settled, there's already a staple crop that is very successful. There are merchants coming to pick it up. There are ships bringing, they figured out the labor system. So they just moved themselves right into that economic model. They did come with the intention of doing fur trade, but they had competition from other settlers, and there really was not a large local supply. They exhausted that fairly early on. Lord Baltimore was expecting to get a fifth part of all the minerals and all the gold and silver that was found, but they never did that until after the Revolution, so he only ever got his 2 Indian arrowheads each year as payment.
No gold or silver?
No gold or silver. Montgomery County after the Revolution.
So instead of being the Gold Coast, we became the Tobacco Coast.
Yes, here's Middleton, definitely.
And so then how did the fact that we were growing tobacco and exporting the tobacco, how did that define the society that developed here in this colony?
Well, tobacco has a couple of characteristics that shape the way the colony develops. It's a crop that is very fragile and bulky, so you don't want to have to move it very far overland. That means you'd like to settle along the river systems. The rivers and creeks in Maryland on the western shore, and been on the eastern shore, is blessed with a lot of waterways that make that possible. And it also is very destructive of the soil, depletes the soil fairly rapidly. You can only grow it for a few years before you've exhausted all the nutrients that tobacco needs. You can grow another crop for a few years, and then you have to let it lie fallow for a 20-year period. That means that you need 50 acres for each person working the land. So you need large tracts of land in order to be successful. And again, that means the population spreads out. And another aspect of it is that you don't have to do much except cut it, cure it, pack it in a barrel, and ship it off. You don't need mills to grind it into flour. You don't need people to make wagons for it. Everything is pretty simplified. So it does nothing to encourage the development of towns. It just fosters this very agricultural, very spread out kind of settlement, which remained the pattern in Maryland until after the Revolution, really.
So we heard last time about the headright system and how people got land in exchange for bringing people to settle in the colony. So say that I'm a settler, a middling-sized settler who has brought 5 or 6 people over, and so I've gotten 50 acres for each of them. How would I, if I wanted to become rich, how would I fulfill that ambition in Maryland?
Well, my advisor in graduate school grew up on a tobacco farm in North Carolina, and he would always tell us that you don't need anything more than family to be successful in supporting yourself on a tobacco farm. There are no economies of scale in tobacco the way there are with sugar and rice or cotton. So there's no incentive to have a lot of land and a lot of laborers. But if you want to get wealthy, that's what you need, because you need a workforce that you don't have to support to the same standard of living as you support your family. Your profit is going to come from the fact that you don't feed them, you don't house them, you don't clothe them with as much expenditure as you do for family members. So you can grow tobacco with family labor, which is basically someone and his sons. You can use hired labor, but it's prohibitively expensive because tobacco requires labor 12 months of the year, and you just can't afford to pay somebody as a hired worker. But if you can get an indentured servant who is bound to you for 3 to 7 years, and you don't have to support him very highly, and you can use more force to get work out of him than you might be able to do with your own reluctant children. Or you can get a slave who would be yours for life, who has children become your property, and whom you have even less need to be careful of. So the person who wants to do well is going to try to get as much labor as possible. And early on, the only options for people who can afford extra labor are indentured servants, because they're being sent from England. There's an arrangement to bring them and the ships that are coming for tobacco. The slavers don't come to the Chesapeake early on because the population there's not enough of a market here. There aren't enough people who can afford to buy slaves. But the first shipment that comes in at 1619, and it's clear from recent scholarship, very intensive look at the records, that people buy slaves as soon as they can get their hands on them. And the people who trade, who have any surplus to trade to the West Indies, they go to the West Indies to get sugar and rum. They bring over wood, barrel staves and things like that. They bring corn, they bring beef, because the sugar planters, their slaves are just producing sugar. They're not growing crops, they're not doing anything else, they're just working those sugar crops. So the West Indies is dependent upon other sources of supply for food and materials, and the Chesapeake is close enough to be able to do that and has the ability to produce those surpluses. So those people in their trade, they will bring back an enslaved worker or two for themselves, for sell to their neighbors. And one of the interesting statistics about the slave trade, it's a total of 16 million people who come to the New World over the course of time that there is a slave trade until 1808. 5% of them come to North America, and most go to South Carolina, because then to the Cotton South. So the Chesapeake takes a very, 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 very small percentage of that trade, because it's the one place where the population actually reproduces by natural increase. So once you have enough of a nucleus of a slaveholding, it will grow of its own accord.
What did it take to transform a forest into a place where you could grow tobacco?
They start by girdling the trees, and that's a process of simply cutting the bark all the way through to kill the tree, because that would stop it from producing leaves, and then the sunlight would be able to get to the tobacco that's planted underneath. They didn't plow land until they start raising wheat. There's no need for that with tobacco. All you have to do is make a hill, and to make a hill you only need your leg and a hoe. You pile up the dirt and you pull your leg out and you put the tobacco seed in. The process, though, is more complicated than that from beginning to end. You start with a seedling bed, then you transplant it, then you have to check it every day the same way you would check the wine, the vines, to make sure they're okay. You had to check the plant to get the worms off, to sucker it, to pull off the tops so that it didn't go to seed. And then you have to cut it at the right time, and you have to be very careful about it's not too moist, it's not too dry. You have to hang it, you let it wilt, you hang it, and so forth. And then finally you pack in a barrel and you ship it off the following spring. You've already started your seed bed for the next year's crop. In the winter you do fencing, you do ditching to clear more land, you make hogsheads for the following year's crop. So the workers are kept busy the entire year, and that's why you have to have somebody you don't have to pay very much.
So, well, that doesn't sound like little work. That sounds like a lot of work. And I know that in your book there are quotations from travelers who say that they find Maryland farmers slovenly farmers.
Yes.
Why would an Englishman or a traveler from Europe find that a Maryland farm was a slovenly place?
Because what they had was a lot of land, and they had a shortage of labor, so they didn't spend labor doing anything that wasn't necessary. Now, when the field was fallow, you weren't doing anything with it, so it naturally starts growing back up again with shrubs and small trees and so forth, so it looks very unkempt. The tobacco cultivation, because you shift the fields, you don't build substantial buildings. There's no point in building a really sturdy tobacco barn because you are going to leave it within a short period of time. The same for the housing for your workers. They're really pretty basic and don't need a lot of care in any kind of finishing. And the animals, they did not pen, they did not build stables or barns for their animals. They just fenced the crops and let the animals run loose. They could find enough feed in the woods to support themselves. So all of those characteristics make for a very untidy landscape by English standards.
if we can fast forward to the 21st century, we were still growing tobacco here in Maryland until 2001, when a subsidy program was put in place in order to kill off the tobacco industry in Maryland. It was thriving at the time. They were producing, with 1,000 growers, they were producing 9.5 million pounds of tobacco. And this subsidy program paid farmers, based on their previous year's averages, a fee to stop growing tobacco. So the three major tobacco auction houses went out of business, and very few people grow tobacco nowadays. As we all drove in, we saw the dilapidated old tobacco barn at the entrance to the driveway.
The slovenly looking tobacco.
The slogan. But anyway, I think thanks to Jean, we understand a little bit more why those tobacco barns were so iconic in Maryland, and now we know why they're falling apart. But I thank you very much for your time.
You're very welcome.
It was delightful. I'm sorry.